Hello guys, and welcome to our final online video lecture. This week we'll be looking at the Treaty of Versailles, which you can see here. Your assignments you did this week, well, the assignment you did on the rise of Hitler actually takes place after this. This is going to set the stage for why those things happened. In that assignment you saw the kind of incredible debt that Germany was in, kind of how they were ashamed of how World War I ended and angry about how the war ended, and the treaty that was signed at the end of the war, which we'll look at how that came about and what the terms of were today. Now, because this is the last week for regular assignments like we've been doing, remember that you have the Rise to Power of Hitler assignment, which was 2 days. You're supposed to work on it Tuesday and Wednesday, and you have the discussion question from this video to submit on Friday or tomorrow. Now, that discussion question, just like the last several weeks, is a quiz grade. The assignment on Hitler will go in as a classwork grade, just like the assignments have in past weeks. Next week is designated by the county as a makeup work week. So if you have any missing assignments, or, and this is very important, or if you have tests that you failed or not, maybe even just not done as well as you want to on them, and you want to try to bring that grade up, you'll have an opportunity for it next week. Now, it's not retaking the test. Instead, I have basically some essay prompt questions. And if you want to make up a test, you can answer one of these essay prompts that I'll email to you and submit that. Now, requests for missing assignments, I'll fulfill as many of those as I can. If it's an assignment that I can easily email to you and you can make up, I will. Now, if you missed like a warm-up or you just didn't do the warm-up in class, that's not one that we can make up at this point. Or certain assignments I can't send, just depending on if I have them digitally or not. But many of them I can. So you can ask for those, or if there's a test specifically that you would like to try to, bump up your credit for with one of the essays, you just have to email me, and this is important, by the end of the day Monday. All right, so you should be hopefully watching this on Thursday. That means you can email me tomorrow, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Monday with requests for those test improvement opportunities or for missing assignments. Now, if you email me after Monday of next week, maybe I'll still get something to you, but I'm basically saying that I will not guarantee it. All right, but if you have the request in by some point on Monday, as in I can log on Tuesday morning and it's there, then you'll get an opportunity either to try to improve a test score, or if it's an assignment I can allow you to make up because I can send it to you, we will. All right, now at the end of next week, your grades will be finalized, so that's it. All right, that's very important to keep in mind as well. This is kind of your last chance to bring those up. The assignments from this week obviously will be part of that as well, but then next week is all about makeup assignments, or for us, for this class, I'm giving you the opportunity possibly to bump up a test grade. The requests must be sent by you by Monday. All right, now, and that request cannot just say, I want to make up test grades. If you want to say, hey, I want to try to improve my Unit 2 test, and I'll look at that. Now, if it's something that you have like a 90, I might email you back and say there's no point. Like if you have a 90 on the test and your class average is an 84, bumping that test grade up is not going to change your grade in any significant way. If you have like a 79, 89, 88, something that could easily change letter grade, that's a whole different story. Those are the kind of ones we're maybe looking to address. All right. Anyways, back to a discussion question later in this PowerPoint, so that's very important that you complete that. It is a quiz grade. So Treaty of Versailles we have mentioned before, right? Louis the 14th. We saw Louis the 13th building the palace, Louis the 14th, 15th living there as well. Now, this is that massive palace, and we'll see pictures of it in just a second, that we saw built in France, right? And it's going to be incredibly significant historically, because we've already mentioned before that, number one, Germany was officially formed as a nation in a treaty and a celebration that took place in the Treaty of Versailles, in the Palace of Versailles. And here we'll see the treaty that ends the fighting of World War I is created and signed in the Palace of Versailles. So not only is it this magnificent, large, incredibly ornate palace that's historically important already, but all of these historic events are taking place there also, which have just really kind of continued the legacy of the palace. So we're looking at, what did the Allies want from the Treaty of Versailles? What was Germany's punishment in the end? What are reparations? And what was the League of Nations? So you see a picture of Versailles, modern day, right out in the front of it. And the Hall of Mirrors. picture more modern as well. Then we see delegates, 1914, in the Hall of Mirrors. You see it's loaded up with delegates from all these different nations, tables set up. They're filling this Hall of Mirrors up as all these discussions are taking place of, hey, the war is going to come to an end. What do we need to agree upon for that to happen? What are the two different sides going to talk about and agree on? What are going to be the punishments for the losing side? How are the side that won, the Allies, are they going to be rewarded? How is it all going to be done? A lot of different opinions on what should happen, how much punishment there should be. I guess really if there should be punishment or not, and then if there is, how severe is it going to be? Right. So why Versailles? The French wanted to crush Germany in the same place where Bismarck formed it in 1871. 1871 is when Germany officially became a nation, like we mentioned. You see the celebration taking place here of the German soldiers as Germany was officially created. Before this, it was Prussia, and they had taken territory from France, Alsace and Lorraine specifically. They took that territory, and then they officially became Germany. So the big three. Three nations are going to have the biggest impact on the Versailles decision. They're going to have the most say. They're seen as the leaders of the Allied powers. So from left to right, you can see the flags. Probably, I would say, hopefully you recognize those. On the left, that is Great Britain. In the middle, France. On the right, the United States. Right, and the leaders of those respective countries. So you see that here. Although there were delegates from 39 different nations at the conference, all the important decisions were made by the leaders of the three strongest Allied powers, the US, Britain, and France. Now you might think there were other nations on the side of the Allies. In the beginning, we talked about the Allied powers. The three nations were Britain, France, and Russia. But as we mentioned before, the war goes so poorly for Russia. Their casualties are so much higher than everyone else fighting. They really realize it's a rude awakening for the Russian people how far behind they are in technology, and that's why the war goes so poorly for them. But because of that, Russia ends up having a revolution. The people of Russia attempt to overthrow the government in Russia during the war, and they are successful. And when a new government takes place or is put in power in Russia, they make the decision to pull Russia out of the war. Now that is the communist government in Russia. Officially, they are becoming the Soviet Union. And when they pull Russia out of the war, Russia's allies, Great Britain and France, feel like they have been betrayed, stabbed in the back, and therefore they are not including Russia as a nation that's going to help decide what happens next. You'll see that Russia is actually treated as a nation that needs to be punished. Right? So pretty harsh for them. So we're going to see three different opinions from these three powers, the big three, America, France, and Great Britain, on what should happen next. All right, very different opinions. Now, hindsight 2020, it's pretty easy to look back and say, man, they should have listened to Woodrow Wilson. However, in that time period, I think it's pretty easy to understand why maybe they didn't, or at least sympathize why they didn't, and we'll see that. But nowadays, we could probably say, man, we maybe should have done that, because this treaty that's created to end World War I is supposed to be, and it is talked about in the time as this treaty that's going to create peace in their time. Right? Everyone thinks, man, World War I was so horrible. The death counts were so high compared to anything else we've ever seen before, so much more deadly than other wars, so many nations involved, right? Just catastrophic on a world scale. So everyone kind of feels like this will never happen again, and we're going to create a treaty to make sure it never happens again. But as we know, you have the sequel, World War II, really not far down the road, right? This treaty being signed 1918, and then, by 1940 we have World War II. So really just over 20 years. Now, Woodrow Wilson from America, we came into the war late, right? World War I had been going on for years by the time we joined in. None of the fighting in World War I happens on American soil, right? Zero fighting happening on our own territory. So the casualties for America are lower because we didn't fight as long, and we don't have any of the damages to our own territory the way that these European countries do. So although we come in as like this peacemaker who doesn't want to punish anyone too severely, it's very easy for the other countries to look at us as like, of course you're not as upset. It wasn't as personal. You didn't fight as long. Didn't happen in your country, right? So they feel like it's easy for us to be less upset. Like we don't really understand the suffering that some of these other nations went through. And that's fair to an extent. But Wilson's ideas said Wilson wanted peace without victory. They're going to create a peace, no victory. That means no one is punished as a loser. No one is rewarded as a winner. Right? Defeated nations to be treated well to avoid a war of revenge in the future. Again, hindsight, that's very smart because we will suffer a war of revenge, which that's what World War II is for Germany, a war of revenge, and it's even more catastrophic and deadly than World War I was. Much more. So Wilson introduced America's goals in his 14 points. He lays out 14 things that he says need to be accomplished, right, in this treaty, what he is looking to do, ways that he feels peace could be ensured, right? And a lot of these points, very smart and accurate. We're not going to go through 1 through 14, something you'll look very specifically at in American history or U.S. history in 11th grade, for most of you. So these points were admired by the Germans, understandably, because it doesn't punish them very much, so they think it's great, very smart. The Germans were fully in support of the U.S. plan. But the other allies, France, Great Britain, did not think they were so great. Wilson wanted to eliminate the basic causes of war, which he identified as nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and alliances. So the same 4 things that we still today give reason as, or say they are the reasons for World War I. So we agree that those were the things that caused World War I. He identifies those and says we need to get rid of or limit those factors to prevent war in the future. Again, smart. He also called for an end to alliances and a reduction of military arms, so militarism and alliances. Self-determination meant that nations that were now setting up their own governments should be able to determine what kind of government they want to have on their own. And in particular, America was worried about this because in Eastern Europe, there were a lot of nations that were gaining independence or being created right on Russia's western border. And the fear was that communism was going to spread from Russia into these other nations. And that's exactly what will happen. And we were afraid that Russia would force its influence on these nations, which they pretty much will. All right? But there's a big fear for America and Great Britain, France as well. These democratic nations are very afraid of the spread of communism. Right? And they see that as a looming problem in the future, which it eventually will be. All right? Wilson also argued for freedom of the seas, so not attacking merchant ships, things like, or passenger ships like Lusitania. Very specifically upset with the conduct of the Germans with the submarines, the unrestricted submarine warfare that the Germans carried out before World War I, which, remember, is the main reason we ended up joining the war. So, in particular, we felt that was uncalled for and outside of the lines of what was acceptable. And he called for the formation of the League of Nations. League of Nations was a group of countries, trying to get as many countries as possible around the world to join, that was created with the goal of settling disputes through negotiation rather than war. So you could have delegates from all these different nations that could try to find ways to avoid war and create peace going forward. A huge alliance, basically, that would dissuade any aggressive nation because all of these members of it would, possibly take action against a country that acted aggressively. Any country that attacked someone else would be punished. Right? And it didn't have to be by military action at first. If a country was just acting outside of what was acceptable, it could be tariffs placed on them. The members of the League of Nations could decide to stop trading with them, or possibly send an armed force from, combined unit from all these different nations to stop aggressive action. Now, the League of Nations will fail, all right? And there's a reason why it fails, and we'll get to that. But we have something that's almost exactly the same that's in use today and has been very successful throughout history in the United Nations, right? So that's kind of attempt 2 at the same idea. Attempt 1 doesn't end up working out. And it's not Wilson's fault that it doesn't work out, but it is kind of, in a large part, the fault of the United States. All right, now we'll see how that happens. The problem is, this ends up being a compromise at the Treaty of Versailles, where no one nation is going to get everything they want. Right, so the U.S. is not going to get all 14 of these points. Wilson is not going to get 14 demands. Everyone's not going to agree to them. But the one that he decides to stick to the most and says, we have to do this. I'll agree to some of the things other countries want to do as long as we do this, is the League of Nations. And when it ends up failing, kind of ends up like the U.S. didn't get much of what we wanted at all. All right, the stance of France, all right, the French Prime Minister Clemenceau, very different opinion than U.S. The opposite of Wilson was Clemenceau from France. He gains the nickname the Tiger for his fierce war policy. He wanted to crush the Germans so they could never again invade France. Make Germany so weak that they would never be a threat to France again. Now, he's the leader of France. France was targeted heavily by Germany in the beginning. It's understandable that he would want to make that not happen again, and he feels like this war was Germany's fault, and the aggression of Germany caused the problems, And he wants to make sure that Germany can never threaten France again. Make them so weak, they can't do anything. And it's incredibly harsh punishments that he sets forth, the things he wants to do. Clemenceau felt that Wilson wanted to be too soft on Germany, and he was quoted saying that God Almighty has only 10, right? Referencing the 10 commandments, saying God only demands 10 things, has 10 commandments of us. Wilson's come in here asking for 14 things, right? He's asking for more than God. A way of trying to say it's way too much. It's way too much to ask. Right? You see this political cartoon from the time. It has Wilson's 14 points up here written out, his ideas, and then it's depicting the Germans as like barbarians, simpletons who would never, like cavemen, right? Who would never be able to understand these 14 points anyways. So they can't, they can't figure it out. They wouldn't be able to understand, so it's not going to work. It's too complicated, right? That's kind of the thing that Clemenceau pushes. Right. And he says, remember, you see this kind of stabbing in the back taking place, saying it's not only Germany that they wanted to punish, it's also the Soviet Union or Russia, because he feels that they didn't honor their alliance with France. They did join the war and fight with France in the beginning, but because they dropped out early, France feels like they were stabbed in the back by Russia. And maybe the war wouldn't have been as costly for France if Russia would have continued fighting, which is probably true, but it had been more detrimental to Russia than anyone by far. All right, and then somewhere in the middle, not a perfect middle, but in between these two opinions, you have David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England. So Britain says Lloyd George of Great Britain held a middle position between Wilson and Clemenceau. While promising to make Germans pay, Lloyd George knew that destroying Germany wouldn't be good for the balance of power in Europe either. If Germany is too weak, they felt that could be a problem actually, because remember the looming threat that they were kind of becoming afraid of was communism and the Soviet Union. And the argument is made that, hey, if Germany is at least somewhat strong, they could help us fight against communism. And that's kind of the idea. A buffer between, Britain and France, between the communist nations, hopefully. He doesn't want to destroy that balance of power. He doesn't want to be too harsh, but he also thinks that what the U.S. has proposed is not harsh enough. So he helped work out many of the compromises between France and the United States, but these compromises are going to lean more towards the opinions of France than the U.S. So punishing the Central Powers. Could say crushing, but it's really punishing. The punishments are as. All right, so first looking at Germany. Germany's punishment for the treaty can be remembered, this is just for you to make it easier to remember, is BRAT, B-R-A-T. The B, the first thing, is that Germany had to accept the blame for starting the war in the form of a war guilt clause. All right, the Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed on them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. All right, and that's straight from the Treaty of Versailles. So this is just, hey, you have to accept. Germany has to sign and say, yes, this war is our fault. And if you remember from last week, we talked about how the war started. There was a lot of countries involved, a lot of things that happened. To be honest, it's really not fair to blame World War I on one nation. That's going out the window. As part of the treaty, Germany has, their government has collapsed, their country has suffered. They are trying to end the war. They are trying to surrender to end World War I. And the Allies are basically saying, okay, we'll stop fighting if you sign this treaty. And the first part of the treaty is you have to sign and say, hey, this war is your fault. Okay, and that just sets up all the other punishments. That's just step one. It might seem like, okay, whatever, just say it's your fault, move on. No, that sets up all of the next parts, which are incredibly severe. The German government has been replaced by a new Weimar Republic, which is technically democratic, right? And one of the first things they will do when they take over is end the war, and they will sign this treaty. And it is very easy for Hitler to come around and to say, look, that Weimar Republic, they are corrupt. They signed this horrible treaty that's so terrible for Germany. It's ruined Germany as a country. They're corrupt. And he ends up saying the only reason they signed it is because they were being paid off under the table. They're not actually looking out for Germany. They're looking out for themselves. And it just so happens that a lot of members of the Weimar Republic are Jewish. And he blames it on them and them being selfish and not caring about Germany. And it just starts this kind of train rolling for Hitler of blaming someone, putting the blame somewhere, not Germany's fault, not the German people's fault, but the blame somewhere else. And because the people were starving, Germany had been wrecked. It was so weak compared to what it was. They didn't have the supplies. They didn't have jobs. Terrible depression hits Germany. in those situations, people want to be able to put the blame somewhere else. They want the government to come through and say, hey, we can fix it. We're going to make things better. And that's exactly what Hitler was promising. All right. So the next part of it, the R, is reparations. And this is an incredibly significant part. Germany had to pay over $33 billion in reparations or fines. 1918, $33 billion. That's an incredible amount. By today's standards, that's somewhere between 300 and 400 billion dollars, right? Like a ridiculously impossible amount. No country could just suddenly be able to pay that. Not even today. Like the U.S. could not pay a $300 billion debt. That's crippling. And you have to remember that what happens in between World War I and World War II is the Great Depression, right? And that's not just the U.S. That's a worldwide depression. So Germany's going through the effects of the Great Depression, and they owe this $33 billion, which is like $300 billion by today's standards, that they have to pay to the Allies, right? It's reparations covered the destruction caused by the war, so damage is done in England, damage is done in France, damage is done in Russia, and any of these countries where fighting took place. They have to pay for it, not including all the damage that was done in Germany late in the war, right? It's all of it has to be paid for them by them. Pensions for the millions of Allied soldiers are going to be paid. Not Great Britain's not going to pay the pensions of their soldiers. It's going to be Germany who pays the pensions of all of these other soldiers. This doesn't even take into account their own soldiers, right? And they're going to pay the widows and they're going to pay the families of soldiers who were killed or wounded in action, right? So incredibly hefty payments. This is going to take 92 years for Germany to get out of this debt from the war. And that's because even with that, it was reduced several times throughout history as well. Something they could not pay. And the problem is Germany could not pay it to an extent there. They had no choice. They couldn't make their payments. And so what do? Well, you hear the suggestion a lot when people are like, why don't we pay people more? Why isn't minimum wage higher? Well, and they say because there's only so much money. And a lot of times you hear the counter argument, well, why doesn't the government just print more? We just print money anyways. It's paper. So just print more money, pay people more. The problem with that, and that's exactly what Germany will do, they couldn't make their payments, so they printed more money to make the payments. What that does, if you're producing more, printing more money, it's going to cause massive inflation because there is more money, supply and demand. More money means the value of money drops, and their value of money plummets to the point where it is worthless, right? And that's the exact same thing that could happen here if you print too much money. What I mean by that, it's like if overnight a $100 bill became worth less than a penny, right? And it's that level of inflation to the point where people in Germany are out of work. They're starving, right? They don't have food. You see pictures of people of Germany going to the store to buy a loaf of bread in this time period, and they're having to push a wheelbarrow full of money, overflowing on the top with money to just try to afford one piece of bread. Right? And you see things like these are people that are starving and don't have money, and then there's like money sitting on the street that's just being swept into the sewers because it's not even worth picking up. It has basically no value. It's worth basically nothing, right? Much less than what even a penny is worth. So people aren't even willing to pick it up. People who don't have jobs and are starving don't even see the value in picking up money on the ground because it's worth nothing, right? And you see pictures of like kids who their families cannot afford toys for them, so they have huge stacks of money tied together. They're using as like blocks and they're building with it. Or you see families that can't afford wood for their furnace to keep the home warm, or coal or wood for it, so they're just burning stacks of money. When paper burns like immediately, doesn't provide any lasting heat, but it's all they had. It's all that was available. Right. So their money essentially becomes worth nothing because of this treaty. The other parts of it, the A for army. Germany was forbidden from having an army of over 100,000 men. They weren't allowed to have submarines. They were not allowed to have an air force. So 100,000 men for a country the size of Germany is nothing. You're talking about the countries around them like France, they're going to have armies that are several million soldiers. So 100,000 against that is nothing. That's basically like a police force. 100,000 men would guarantee they couldn't invade another country. No submarines, no air force. So Germany's military strength is basically, wiped away completely. Now, this all raises the question of, do you think when 20 years later, when Hitler starts World War II and he starts invading, France, do you think he does that with no air force? Do you think he does it with an army of 100,000 men? Of course not. Right? When he takes over, part of what he does is he breaks piece by piece every part of the Treaty of Versailles. He says, we're not paying the reparations. Stops making payments. He starts building an air force. He starts building a navy. He starts building his army well above 100,000. And you think, if he started this, the minute he started building a navy, or the minute he started building an air force, the Allies could have taken action. They had plenty of people there. They knew he was building it. He's not doing it in secret. He starts building airplanes and ships and bombs, and they're parading them around in the street, taking pictures of it, celebrating, kind of like what you see from North Korea today. Right, all these footage of like parades taking place, showing off their military strength, showing off the new missiles they make, the tanks, the airplanes. Same thing happening in Germany. But the Allies are so weary from World War I, they don't want to fight again, that they don't take any action. They don't do anything. They just ignore it again and again until eventually Germany builds the strongest military in the world. And by the time World War II starts, most powerful military in the world. It could have been stopped the minute they started building it up again in a much smaller conflict. But nobody wanted to take action. Nobody wanted to fight. And a lot of people felt that, hey, it might be good if Germany's a little strong because they could help us fight against Russia. Russia was communist. Germany under Hitler was fascist. Part of fascism, part of its core ideas is that they hated communism. So they thought he'd definitely be an ally. In the end, that's not what happens. Right? It says Germany lost territory and colonies to Britain and France. Alsace-Lorraine were returned to France. They lost land to Poland, and the Rhineland was to be occupied by Allied troops. They split Germany into a couple pieces to try to weaken it. Again, Hitler's going to start taking these pieces of land back piece by piece, and nothing is done when he does it. He demands a part. They just give it to him. They think, okay, he'll be happy now. He'll back now, and we can avoid a war. Just give him what he's asking for again and again until he eventually invades Poland, and they realize this is never going to stop. Right? By that point, it's too late. So you see, the Treaty of Versailles has punished Germany in such a severe way. Right? It's depicted them as the German devil that you see here, putting all that death on them, making it their fault, which really for World War I, that was not fair. World War II, you could say is Germany's fault. It's the Treaty of Versailles and Germany's fault. They're the aggressor. World War I, they were part of it, but they're not the sole reason that the war happened. That doesn't matter. That's what the treaty is creating. And so Germany's punished. They're being depicted as the devil. French propaganda, on the other hand, you see they're celebrating. They're happy. The sky is ours. The land is ours. Lorraine and Alsace are ours. Everything's great. Okay, so Europe before 1919, you see Germany and Austria-Hungary here. Pay attention to how that changes. And then after 1919, after the Treaty of Versailles. So Poland is created. They take territory that splits Germany in two pieces there. You see that what was Austria-Hungary has just been blown up, right? Part of it becomes Poland. You got Czechoslovakia, you got Hungary, you got Austria, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. All these nations taking part of that territory. Austria-Hungary was an empire before. It's not, doesn't even exist now. Wiped off the map. And you see the western and eastern part of Germany in the red split by Poland also. That's the first area, that Polish corridor in the north, that northern part of Poland that would connect Germany is going to be the first thing that Hitler demands to be given back to Germany. And the west of Germany is demilitarized, which means that Germany cannot send any troops there because it was the part of their country that bordered France. They didn't even want troops being in the western portion of Germany because they could see it as a threat to France. And one of the first things Hitler does after building his military up some is sends troops to train there, just to be stationed there and train there. Not doing anything yet, just testing to see if the Allies will do anything about it. They won't. They just ignore it and let it go. So Hitler again and again sees that he can get away with anything. And the Allies are too scared to fight again. The only country that wanted to fight again was Germany, right? So that gives them a lot of power here. So you see the red territory taken away, some in the north, Polish corridor in the east, Alsace and Lorraine in the west. Which you see how small Alsace and Lorraine is, but highly disputed territory. There are some important resources there. So continuing to punish the Central Powers, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led to the independence of 4 new nations: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Montenegro made up Yugoslavia. Austria was deprived of its entire empire and became a small nation. Because Romania fought with the Allies, they gained land, while Bulgaria, who fought with the Central Powers, lost territory. So a lot of shifting and changing here in the Balkans. Continuing, The Ottoman Empire was also broken up because they had joined the Central Powers. Some of the territories were given independence, while others, like Palestine, Iraq, and Syria, were given to Britain and France to control. Since Russia's new communist government left the war early, they were not invited to Versailles. Like we mentioned before, they're not one of the 39 nations there, but they are still accounted for in the treaty. They are punished by the treaty. The Allies wanted to weaken Russia to keep communism from spreading westward, so 4 new nations gained independence from Russia. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were all created as new nations taking territory from Russia. Poland also gained a big chunk of its territory from what used to be Russia. And Romania took territory from Russia. So imagine being Russia here. This is kind of wild to me. Not even invited to the Treaty of Versailles meetings. Not taking part in it. They tell you you can't come. 39 other nations are coming. You cannot come. But you will get a letter in the mail, from the Allies, Britain, France, America, that says, hey, just so you know, at this treaty we decided, at these meetings we decided that we're taking all this territory from you, creating new nations, giving it to other countries, just so you're aware. This territory that used to be yours isn't yours anymore. We decided without you. If you try to resist, obviously there'd be huge punishments. So Russia has no choice. They're not in a good spot for this. But definitely some bad blood created here. So you see outlined in white there all the territory that was taken from Russia. That's a huge, massive chunk of land. Great Britain, that's more than Great Britain is total taken from Russia. The thing that Wilson held to, the thing that he wanted, was the League of Nations. President Wilson succeeded and formed the League of Nations. The countries that joined the League promised to take cooperative economic and military action against any aggressive country. Although the League was Wilson's idea, the United States Congress rejected the League because Americans feared it would pull them into future European wars. So he comes back, and hey, the one thing that I fought for that I wanted was the creation of this League of Nations. I believe it's going to create an everlasting long peace for us. And Congress looks at it and they think, man, I don't know, being in this league, it might pull us into more European wars and problems. We don't want any of that. We're not going to join. So imagine if you were one of the countries who is joining it, and the country who came up with the League of Nations, it was the U.S.'s idea under Wilson, decides they don't want to join because they think it's dangerous. How much hope is that going to give the other countries like France or Britain or Russia, Germany? Why would they want to stay in it if the country who came up with it didn't even want to be part of it? The League of Nations will be created, and it will function for a little while, but the U.S. will not be part of it. So the country who came up with it doesn't want to be part of it. That's not a good start, right? And really, in the end, that means the U.S. basically didn't get anything that we wanted. So anger over Versailles, kind of widespread. Many nations were upset with the treaty, felt like it wasn't right, felt like their goals were not achieved. Clearly, Germany, punished so severely, they're not going to be thrilled. So they were horrified by the reparations, reduced military and territorial loss. America felt that the treaty was too harsh on Germany, and U.S. Congress never approves it. We never approved officially the Treaty of Versailles. Now, what does that mean? That just means the U.S. doesn't honor it. We're not putting our name on it. We're not partaking. We're not being paid reparation money. None of that. But it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It's still going to happen. Italy wanted land from Austria. They got some. They didn't get as much as they wanted, so they're left feeling like they were cheated, and they're upset. Japan didn't get as much land as they wanted. Not all the territory they claimed from China, or technically took from Germany within China, not all of it was given to them. Most of it was given back to China. So Japan is left feeling angry, like they didn't get the reward they should have. Interesting, because countries that felt like they were spurned, Italy and Japan, are going to be the main allies of Germany in World War II. All 3 of them were upset about the treaty, so they're all going to end up joining sides and being the aggressors in World War II. Anger over Versailles, Russia obviously as well, and China too. China was angry that Japan had been given some of the territory that they took from Germany. They don't get all of it, so Japan's not happy because they didn't get all of it. China's upset because Japan got some. And then most of us, you see that flag in the top right with the red, yellow, blue, white, and black. Not what we think of as China's flag, but at the time it was. And then Russia, they got the Soviet flag there, the red with the yellow hammer and sickle and star, as they were the Soviet Union at this point. We're just referring to them as Russia. Was angry that they were not invited to Versailles and upset over losing territory at a meeting they weren't even part of. Right. So unfortunately, the treaty that was created to end the war, to end all wars, right? Because that's what World War I was referred to at the time. The war to end all wars. No one's going to want to fight anymore. This was so horrible. Merely provides the motivation for World War II just 20 years later, which will be an even more devastating and catastrophic war. All right. Then the discussion question for this week, a couple parts to it, so I separated it, but it's really one question. All right. Make sure your answer should be clearly, paragraph format, a little bit longer here, not just 2 or 3 sentences. So how did the Treaty of Versailles play a major role in leading to World War II? How did everything that happened with the Treaty of Versailles end up leading to World War II? It's what we were just talking about, right? Resentment and all that's created. Explain each of the impacts the treaty had on Germany. So how did this treaty impact Germany specifically? BRAT, the 4 parts of the treaty against Germany. How did the decisions made in the treaty impact the German people? What is life like for German people now that this treaty has been signed? Okay. And what could have been done differently? What do you think? I mean, that one's kind of more you, and what in general, what do you think could have been done differently to maybe make this not a treaty that leads to World War II? Right. So those are the things to consider. Again, tomorrow, Friday, you should be turning in your assignment from Tuesday and Wednesday on Hitler's rise to power, and you should be turning in this discussion question. If you have assignments that you want to make up, or if you want to try to improve a test score, you need to email me with those requests by the end of the day Monday. Earlier is fine as well, right? But if they're after Monday, I'm not going to guarantee that you'll get that opportunity, right? If you want it for sure, have a chance to do those things. Make sure you email me by some point on Monday. All right, thank you.